Hello, and welcome to Interdependent Study, our podcast where we engage in the learning and unlearning work for social justice and collective liberation. I'm Aaron.
Yes, you are.
And thank you.
I'm Damien. Thank you so much for joining us today.
For those new to our podcast, Interdependent Study is meant to be a space and community for folks who believe in and want to do the work for social justice.
Each week, we bring something new to the table and discuss our thoughts and feelings about it through the lenses of who we are and where we can go for a more just society.
And we want Interdependent Study to be a space we're always learning with one another. And Damien, you're up this week. So what is it that you are bringing to the table today?
I am. Did I say my name was Damien earlier?
I think
do
so.
That part? Okay,
yeah.
Great. Well, I'm Damien.
If not, I confirmed it by calling you Damien just now.
It's been a long day, but I'm excited to be here because I have brought a documentary to the table for us. It was incredible. Yep. The film is called I Am Not Your Negro. It was first released back in 2016 and was directed by the one and only Raoul Peck, who we certainly have a lot of admiration for at this table. He centered this film on James Baldwin's unfinished book called Remember This House. And he used it to explore the history of racism in the United States sort of blanketly through James Baldwin's work and his sort of lived experiences, thoughts, and observations on things like racism, race relations, and civil rights in this country. But the film also explored Baldwin's personal and professional reflections on three sort of marquee and credible leaders during the civil rights movement, those being Medgar Evers, Martin Luther King Jr., and Malcolm X, and certainly on their lives and their work. And, I said this at the top, it just was an incredible film. I thought it was really well done, which, of course, with Raoul Peck attached to it, it would be. But I thought it was educational. I thought it was thorough. And honestly, I thought it was, there were moments where I don't know, I thought it was beautiful. I got a little emotional in the sense of how it showcased a lot of James Baldwin's sort of raw and personal thoughts and reflections, and how it looked at his relationships with Medgar and Martin and Malcolm and the impact of their deaths. I mean, there were moments where, after he talked about sort of each of them dying, I felt like, you could hear in his voice his true feelings about them, and he was sad about, them being assassinated. And so I appreciated that beauty in it. So I'm excited to talk about this one. For sure. This will be a favorite for me. But yeah, where do you want to start? What stood out to you?
Yeah, I think, like you said, that the reflection on his relationship with Medgar and Martin and Malcolm really was powerful.
Yeah.
Because they all were different. They all had different sort of places in how things were going.
Yes.
And they all had different perspectives.
And in slightly different stages of life too.
Right.
And age and all of that. So yeah.
Yeah. But his relationship with all of them was, it was just powerful to see how they were connected.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, I mean, for me, this film, and as expected, because I'm pretty sure I've watched this before.
Yep.
And because of how much I appreciated Exterminate All the Brutes.
Oh, yeah.
Which is also a Raoul Peck film. I thought this was excellent. There's a similar style to this film and to Exterminate, where there's a bunch of archival footage.
Yes.
And pictures that illustrate the points that James Baldwin was making throughout the book, the unfinished work, Remember This House, and some of the interviews and stuff that he had pulled in from
his speeches and
and the narration from Samuel L. Jackson is like perfect.
Yes,
throughout the film, and I know that I think when people hear that Samuel L. Jackson is doing something, they have a particular vision in mind for what that is, and this is not that.
This is not that.
There are
moments.
Subdued.
Yeah, there are moments in it where I'm like, I lose that it's Samuel L. Jackson. It's he's brilliant.
It's Which is not to say that he's not normally brilliant.
Yes.
This is just a perfect application for this film and what this film is. And one of the themes that I think that I pick up on from Baldwin, that I appreciate about him, at least from what I've read and seen from him in this film and other things I've read, is the way that he holds the mirror up to white America.
Yes.
This so-called race problem that he is consistently asked about in these interview clips that we see is one that was created by white America, and he stares us in the face and tells us that throughout all of those clips, throughout the words he wrote for this unfinished manuscript, and throughout much of the rest of his work as well. And I just appreciate that theme from him so much, because it's such a needed thing to say, to communicate, to impart on the whole country.
Yeah, and really sort of a further application of that. I love that metaphor, right? Like holding a mirror up. I couldn't think of a way to describe it, but that's exactly what it is, holding a mirror up. And I think what he's also trying to do is, in addition to sort of holding the mirror up to white America, he's also trying to get white America to hold the mirror up for itself, right?
Yeah.
And to ask itself some really critical, important questions. And so, yeah, that's a huge theme of his work, his life, his legacy, right?
Yeah.
And the words that he shared, particularly in this film, that was just brilliant. And so I appreciate that. I think there's so many things that we could talk about from this film, that being one of them. I think there's a lot in this film that we could reflect on and connect to the issues we face in our society today, right?
Yeah.
And in our sort of continued work that we're doing, right? And so one example that I was struck by in this film was really just right out the gate from the opening scenes and the archival footage that you mentioned in this film. We're witnessing and hearing about school integration.
Yeah.
And those scenes were wild.
So,
right?
Yeah.
Like, we're literally seeing, and we've seen this before, but we're seeing white people protesting at schools where black children are trying to enter, and we see the real anger and hatred and vitriol that these folks had. We see them yelling and cursing and even spitting on black children.
Yeah.
And there was a moment that, I mean, it just caught me off guard. I literally had to pause the film and rewind it because I was like, did she just say that, right? There's this moment we hear this white woman at one of these protests say something to the effect of, and my gosh, I rewinded it, but I didn't write the exact quote. But she said, God can forgive things like murder, but he can't forgive integration. I was just like, what are we talking about?
Yep.
But for me, sort of this idea of the connections between that and the parallels that I see between what we saw there and what we see today, right? Like what we saw on January 6th, for example, with the insurrection, right? Or what we're seeing now with what's happening in schools and school curriculums being modified and books being banned, right? And sort of who is behind the push for all of that, right? And what they're saying, right? Like we see what that anger and hatred, and I think as James Baldwin pointed out in this film, what fear can do to people, right? And I love how he spoke about fear, right? He named that as sort of this like key emotion and motivator for white folks at the time. And I thought that was sort of spot on. So for me, I think one of the many lessons I take from James Baldwin, I think we all can take from him, is what speaks to this idea of the kind of heart work that needs to continue to be done, right, as we fight for social justice, right? Like, people are motivated by their emotions, right? And so if we can continue to speak to and think about and be reminded of and be in community with each other's humanity, right? And we can let some of that hatred, anger, vitriol, fear go, like that is important work that needs to happen.
Yeah, it is. And I think that he held multiple things. He held multiple truths about that. So one of the things that stuck out to me is this quotation from an interview clip that's a little bit later in the film, where Baldwin says, quote, "I don't know whether the labor unions and their bosses really hate me. That doesn't matter. But I know I'm not in their unions. I don't know if the real estate lobby has anything against black people, but I know the real estate lobby is keeping me in the ghetto. I don't know if the Board of Education hates black people, but I know the textbooks they give my children to read and the schools that we have to go to. Now this is the evidence. You want me to make an act of faith, risking myself, my life, my woman, my sister, my children, on some idealism which you assure me exists in America. which I have never seen.
Ooh.
And I appreciate this for so many reasons because, as you said, there's so much heart work to have happen. And he held that, and I think he held that as a truth. And he held that there's, to a certain extent, as much heart work as you do, there has to be other work too. It can't just be that.
Yes.
Because people as individuals might or might not be full of hate or fear for you, but the culture and the system that they're growing up in does have that hate or that fear.
100%.
And so I appreciate this quote that he had, what he said here, because it's this sort of dismissal of hate as a key element of the processes of racism. And hate doesn't seem to hold much weight for him because he doesn't know if people hate him or black people in general, but ultimately it doesn't matter because black people are excluded from the so-called American dream, regardless of the individual decisions that people make that might be hateful.
Yep.
And he points out that he has never seen this dream in reality, but because of some progress in the laws of the country and some pleasant photo opportunities of government passing legislation and signing things, he now has to just jump to believing that this dream does exist.
Right.
And that's what's now being demanded of him and of black people in general. And, you know, he hasn't seen that progress in labor unions or neighborhood segregation or the education system.
Right, all of these institutions.
He's being asked to risk his life and take the word of white America that this is something that is now safe to do, despite all of the evidence, the decades, the centuries of evidence to the contrary. And so, yeah, I appreciated that moment because it's so real. And I wanted to mention it here because it ties into what you said about heart work, and it I think creates a big holistic picture.
Absolutely.
Of all kinds of sides, multiple facets of what the work is and what he was suggesting we need to do.
Yeah, and this idea of sort of, you know, trying to, you know, as you said earlier, right, hold a mirror up, right? And let's talk about it. Let's be real about what's going on here, right? Like, and so that speech was incredible, and just this idea of, I think the end of that is so beautiful. This idea of, you expect me to do this when I haven't seen. I haven't seen it. I can't have faith in something I haven't seen, and I have no reason to believe may exist, right?
Yeah.
And it's beautiful to think about. There's so much earlier in this piece in the film where we hear about his story, we hear about how he grew up, we hear about his, he didn't have a lot of disdain for white people, right? He really, I think, loved people. He was centered in love, right? And but at the same time, he could see it how it was, right?
Yeah.
And name it for what it was. So yeah, I absolutely appreciated that. One of the speeches, one of the many speeches, one of the other speeches in this film that stood out to me was the very final speech of the film. It was from an interview that he gave in 1963. And I was so moved by this. I went and actually found the transcript of the entire interview. It is so good. I would encourage everyone to check it out. I took the note down. I took the quote down. I'm not going to read it here because it uses the N-word in it multiple times. But one sentence from it was this, quote, "It is entirely up to the American people and our representatives. It is entirely up to the American people whether or not they are going to face and deal with and embrace this stranger they have maligned so long." Right? And I think this connects to what you were just talking about too, right? I think one of the major points that he tried to get across in this interview is the idea of the importance of searching for and healing the soul of America, right? And pushing for America to find the moral strength to do that, right? And I loved that, right? I loved that at the heart of his words was this naming of what he saw was being the stake, what being at stake was the future, right, of our country. And I think he spoke to that throughout this interview in many ways. And I think it certainly continues to speak to the why behind the fight for social justice and the work that we need to do. That speech is worth listening to.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that I took another chunk of that for application later on. So we'll continue to talk about it. But one of the things that I really liked about that is that and this is one of the things that I think made me think of this mirror idea, is that he talks about the much maligned stranger, that he mentions there, was as a creation of the American people, of the American project, and that creation has to be like the process of creating that has to be reckoned with.
Right.
Yeah.
And I just love that he names and owns who he is and what he is, right? And what white America has applied, right? And how white America has maligned black people is not something that he resonates with, that black people resonates with, right?
Yeah.
And so it is exactly that holding of the mirror that is just so poignant and brilliant and beautiful and necessary, right?
Yeah.
Because you can call me whatever you want, but that's not who I am.
Right. It's in the title.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So speaking of white America maligning black people, we've talked about the FBI on here before.
Hey.
Specifically in the context of Dr. King.
Yes.
And the way that the Bureau spied on him. We watched a film about that. But also in the context of law enforcement surveillance of the many black freedom movements throughout our history and up to today. We've talked about that in a few different ways, I believe. But there's a moment here in the film where the film shares pieces of the FBI's file on James Baldwin.
Of course, they have one.
Which calls him a potential danger to national security because of his following that he's developed and the sort of authority of voice he had developed as an author, as a speaker, which, as I reflect on what we mean when we talk about collective liberation here, and I think what Baldwin was talking about with the real reckoning of how and why race and racism has been developed in the way that it has, it does require a threat to the current order of things.
Yes.
Because we can't actually address racism and classism, which he also names in several ways throughout the film, without reconsidering the foundation of this country and the flaws in that foundation. And the FBI doesn't want that.
Yes.
The white power structures don't want that reckoning, so much so that they've gaslit themselves into believing these flaws don't exist, which means everything that suggests a critical reflection on those cracks and those flaws in the foundation is a threat. It's deemed a threat. It has to be deemed a threat, even when the so-called threat considers himself a witness.
Yeah.
Which is what James Baldwin called himself at one point in the film.
Oh, man.
A person whose role it is to see the realities of the conditions and get the stories out into the world. And I think it's just another point of like, this man was an author and a thinker and in many ways a philosopher.
Yes.
And he was a threat to the power structure. And so it just made me think about what it is that we mean when we talk about threats, either like, from the FBI level or when we talk about sort of, threats and like a SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Like, what is it that we mean when we talk about threats? We talked about security and safety a few weeks ago too, in Ray Atkinson's book. And it just made me think and consider what we mean when we talk about threats, and what those threats actually, like what's
at the core?
What's at the core of the threat, and why is it that we need to call things threats?
I'm smiling at you because that is brilliant. That was brilliant, my friend. Thanks for bringing that up.
Yeah.
I think I don't have a single point to add to that and to modify that. I co-sign it completely. The only thing I would sort of add to it is just also this idea of threat. I think it was in this film, or maybe it was in the MLK FBI film, but whoever we're hearing from, who represents the FBI, talks about how, this person is a threat, but we're here for you. We're here for your safety.
Yeah, they're talking to white America.
They're talking to white America, right?
Yeah,
and so there's also just this other sort of PR, other sort of thread that goes along with what that thread actually is, and who the FBI is there to serve. I picked up on that in that piece. It must have been this, right?
J. Edgar Hoover.
Yes, that's who it is, of course. Right, like, we're here to serve you, and I'm like, who are you here to serve?
Yeah.
Right? Who are you actually talking to here?
Yeah.
Oh, we got it. We know, and so My man. That was great. All right. Well, let's shift. I've been on the edge of my seat because you talked about application already. So I want to hear where you want to go. We're going to shift our conversation here to application and talk about what ways we can apply what we've talked about today and the lessons from this incredible film to our daily lives. I've said this multiple times. I was really moved by this film and by the life and really the work of James Baldwin. We, of course, have had so many leaders from the civil rights movement to admire and respect and learn from. And Mr. Baldwin is certainly one of them. And so for me, I think the application that this film provides is just another way into the incredible insight that James Baldwin offered us. I mean, to listen to and truly digest his words, his insight, his perspective on race relations in this country. The way you talked about him holding up a mirror, that's what I mean here, right? The way he so eloquently talked about what was in the hearts and minds of people in this country, specifically of white people and black people in this country at the time. I think he was so spot on with so much of it, you know? And I just think there's so much wisdom in learning from that and also continuing to do that in our present day, right? So this idea of holding that mirror up, like how can we continue to do that, right? Especially when I think about the challenges we face today are some holdovers from the past, but they are also just mind-boggling things, that conditions that people are living in, attacks from the right, all the things that we've been talking about here lately. But I think there's some really, truly transformative power in what that effort, what we take from James Baldwin, what that could potentially do for us.
Yes. Yeah, agreed. I think there's so much wisdom in Baldwin's collective work that still applies to today. And I think my application sort of connects to that. It ties back into what I said at the beginning when Baldwin was asked about so-called race problems. And he held up that mirror to white America. He said, quote, and this is from later in the film, I believe.
Okay.
Yeah, it's from later.
Okay.
He said, quote, "You cannot lynch me and keep me in ghettos without becoming something monstrous yourselves. And furthermore, you give me a terrifying advantage. You never had to look at me. I had to look at you. I know more about you than you know about me. Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." So how can we face our monstrousness collectively? Too often we think about the monstrousness of the individual, which I alluded to earlier, but individuals have been trained. They've been taught how to be monsters. They've absorbed that. And in so many ways, the qualities of that monstrousness is just in the air that we breathe and the water that we drink. It's all around. Generally speaking, the great mass of white people in this country have never had to reckon with this. So this applies to our everyday lives, no matter what our identities are. We're all living in the reality of a legacy of violence based on white supremacy in this country.
I feel like I was so moved by so much of this film, and I continue to be. And that quote, "You never had to look at me. I had to look at you. I know more about you than you know about me." I mean, we're going to continue to talk about that offline. It gets me. All right, let's talk about homework so we can get to that conversation. What do we want to do once we leave this table today? I want to continue to hear this man in my head and my heart. I want to continue to take in the wisdom and the lessons from Mr. Baldwin. I recently got James Baldwin's book, The Evidence of Things Not Seen, which is an essay he wrote that centers on the brutal Atlanta child murders that took place between 79 and 81, and sort of the variety and the myriad of social and racial issues surrounding Atlanta at that time. And the book actually has a foreword that was written by Stacey Abrams, who is incredible, obviously. So I'm going to add that to our list, call that my homework for the week. Any way to continue to hear this man, I want to do it. What about you?
Yeah, I love that idea of reading more Baldwin. I think I've read a couple things, Go Tell It on the Mountain and Notes of a Native Son, both of which were great.
Yes.
And I'd like to get into some more of his work. There's also a book I want to read about about Baldwin and his work and his philosophy about
Okay.
race and the lies we continue to tell ourselves about race in America. It's
Yeah.
called Begin Again by Eddie Glaude, who is a professor of philosophy at Princeton, I believe. I didn't write down that part, so my apologies to Dr. Glaude if I messed any of that up. But it's been on my to-do list or to-read list since it came out back in 2020. So it might be time to move it up.
Let's do it. Let's revisit that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
let's revisit it, open it up. I also want to, before we move on to talking about other stuff, I want to shout out Canopy real quick, which is the platform we watched this on. It's Canopy starting with a K, and it is connected to local libraries. So it is a video streaming service connected to local libraries, and it has so much great stuff on it. So everybody sign up, connect your library card to it, get a library card if you don't have one.
Yeah.
And watch all the great stuff in here. There's stuff about bell hooks. There's things about masculinity. They break down all these different categories. There's stuff about categories for race. There's categories for gender. There's categories for LGBTQ plus. There's so many different things to watch and absorb and see and learn from on this platform. So I wanted to shout them out real quick because I realized we hadn't talked about that yet.
I appreciate that because I'm going to be 100% honest. We sat for a while last week before we read this to get Canopy, re-download it. We both had it. And when I got home and I finally sat down and watched this, I watched it on Hulu because it's on Hulu.
I didn't know it's on Hulu.
Yeah, so it's on Hulu currently, but who knows? It could go away. But absolutely, Canopy is worth a shout out. Check it out. The films on there look incredible. So yes, totally worth it. All right, Aaron, you're up next week.
Yeah.
What are you bringing to the table in our next episode?
I'm bringing a book as part of our plan to try to read a book a month for the show.
Yes.
We're slightly behind because of, I had a baby with my my lovely wife and family. So that shifted our calendar a little bit. But this book is called Let This Radicalize You, which was written by Kelly Hayes and Miriam Kaba and was released just about a month ago as we record this episode. Came out late May.
Yes.
And this book is chock full of lessons about organizing from people who are on the ground doing the work every day. Here's a little piece of the description from Haymarket Books, a publisher. It says this, quote, "What fuels and sustains activism and organizing when it feels like our worlds are collapsing? Let This Radicalize You as a practical and imaginative resource for activists and organizers building power in an era of destabilization and catastrophe." And that's the end of that quote. It's a great book from what I've read so far, and I've already learned a lot from it.
Yes.
And I've got quite a bit to go because I feel like I'm a little bit behind on reading it.
Same.
So, but it's fantastic, and I'm looking forward to our conversation about it here.
I can't wait. It's so far so good. So I know we're going to have a great conversation about it. So join us.
Yeah.
All right. So with that, we want to thank you for joining us today and for listening to Interdependent Study. You know what I'm going to ask you to do here, but in case you forgot, please follow, leave a rating and review, share our podcast with everybody you know, follow us on the socials, check us out on the YouTubes, and sign up for our email list to get notified about any new things we've got going on behind the scenes.
Yes. Thank you so much for listening. And remember, it's not about us, but it is about us. And we'll talk to you next week.